Hello and thank you for joining me for briefing 9 in the series on charity marketing brought to you by the Worshipful Company of Marketers. My name is Peter Rees and in this briefing we're going to discuss part 2 of tactics. If you look at the agenda for this briefing, you see that I'm going to start with a checkpoint on where we've got to with our current discussion about marketing tactics. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular element of the tactical mix, which is the P for promotion, and I'm going to go into a concept called the communications mix. I'll then talk about the idea of integrated communications and its importance and use in marketing, and then I'll go through a particular model called the stakeholder journey and an extra framework that I've developed called the RISA model, and I'll explain that when we get to that particular part of this briefing. I'll then overview the next steps in subsequent briefings, discuss with you how any questions can be handled, and finish as usual with some concluding remarks. I'll start by reminding you where this briefing fits in the overall series and structure that we've been following, and that is the Saucetech model. As you can see here in this briefing, we're going to stay on the area of tactics, and this is part 2, which I'll be focusing on one of the elements of the marketing mix, the P for promotion. I'm now going to develop some of these ideas a little bit further when I talk about a concept called the communications mix, which is all about building your communications plan, which I'll introduce here in this briefing and continue the discussion in the briefing that follows. Let me remind you then where promotion fits in with the rest of the communications mix elements. You remember from the last briefing we started to introduce the marketing mix looking at the 4 P's of physical products. That's product, price, promotion and place. And I'll save promotion for a moment. So within physical products we had the product, the price and the place. And then I introduced 3 extra marketing mix elements which were to do with services. And these, if you recall, were people, process and physical evidence. But as you can see here, there's one of the 7 P's missing, and this is the P of promotion, which ties all of these things together and communicates messages about our marketing mix to our target stakeholders, whether it's donors or beneficiaries or sponsors or volunteers. So that's how the promotion element of the marketing mix fits in together. It is the tool by which you deliver messages about the rest of the marketing mix to your target audience. I'll say a little bit more here about the 3M's model that I introduced you to in the last briefing. You may recall that it covers 3 areas: the message, the market and the method. I'll be saying more about these in following slides, but essentially the message describes what you wish to say, the market describes whom you wish to communicate with, and the method is how will you deliver the message in the most efficient way. To do that, I'll build on the Saucetech model, which we've already discussed and been using for some time now in these briefings. And just to remind you, the Saucetech model is a registered trademark of Paul Smith, who's the marketing professional and academic who invented this model. So thank you again to Paul. So Saucetech is situation, objective, strategy, tactics, action and control. And we've been focusing on the last briefing and in this one on the T of tactics. And just to remind you, tactics is all about a concept called the marketing mix, which is product, price, promotion, place, people, process and physical evidence. Now, as I've already explained, we're going to focus in this briefing particularly on the P for promotion. As we start to build on the P for promotion, we start to think about the 3M's that I talked about on the last slide: the message, the market and the method. As I said on a previous slide, the method part of the 3M's model is all about the tools and techniques you can use to deliver those messages to your chosen markets. And here's a list of the most popular ones. You can see it's a mixture of physical communications such as advertising or lobbying conferences, and more digital approaches such as email or search engine marketing, your website and social media, that we'll be discussing in much more detail later on in this briefing and in the one that follows. And you'll notice on the far right of this slide is a list of the particular social media tools, some of the social media channels that are very popular today. Now it's interesting, when I'm often invited in to do some consultancy work for charities or other, in fact, commercial organisations, everybody often seems to focus on that list of social media. They talk about Facebook and what should they be doing on YouTube or Twitter. And if you look at the totality of this model of where those social media tools fit in, it's not appropriate to talk about those before you go through the steps of Saucetech. You look at the whole of the marketing mix, then you pick out the promotion and think of message market method, then you look at the tools and techniques you can use, some of which are social media. So it's inappropriate to dive in and start with the social media tools unless you've worked from effectively left to right across this diagram to see why you got there and if it's the most appropriate things to do. The other thing I draw to your attention is everything in this box on the right hand side of the screen. All of these tools and techniques are known collectively as the communications mix. And the communications mix is a summary of the tools and techniques and channels you can use to deliver your message. And often when I'm talking about these ideas for the first time, sometimes people, particularly my academic students, get confused between the marketing mix and the communications mix. So just to summarize what you can see here on this slide, the marketing mix is the 7 Ps, one of which is promotion, and the communications mix is all the tools and techniques that one could use to deliver your chosen messages to your target markets. So just get those two concepts clear in your mind so that you don't get them mixed up. I've spent quite a few slides there talking about the academic theory and the background and the framework for all of this. Let's look at now at how you apply these in practice. This tabular approach I'm going to show you now is something that I've developed after many years of trial and error building marketing communications programs for commercial organisations and latterly for charities. So across the top row you have a list of the different target stakeholder groups with whom you wish to communicate. So what I'm showing here as Market 1, Market 2, Market 3 and so on might, for example, be for a charity. Market 1 might be the beneficiaries, Market 2 might be volunteers, Market 3 might be sponsors, and Market 4 might be donors, and so on. You might wish to communicate with perhaps politicians or the media or the local community. So list across the top row the different groups of people, the target stakeholders with whom you wish to communicate. Down the left hand side, in the left hand column, you need to specify and define the messages that you wish to get across. So message 1 might be an announcement about the launch of a new service or offering that you're bringing to the market. Message 2 might be a call to action for volunteers. Message 3 might be some call to action from donors or sponsors, and so on. So make a list of all the different messages down the left hand column. And then in the middle, you fill in the cells in the middle what I've called method 1, method 2, method 3. And this is the tools and techniques you picked from the table I showed you on the previous slide when we talked about the communications mix. So for example, method 1 might be advertising, method 2 might be social media, method 3 might be your website, method 5 might be direct mail or an email campaign. And we'll talk about these methods in much more detail in the next briefing, but this is just to show you how it all hangs together. Now, if you spend a few minutes thinking about this, the following points may occur to you. First of all, some markets get just one message and some markets get several messages. So beneficiaries might get more than one message, whereas perhaps volunteers only get one. The second point is some messages go to one market and some messages go to several markets. So if you're announcing a new product and service, you might want to communicate it certainly to the beneficiaries, but also you might wish to communicate it to the local community or perhaps to politicians or to the media. The third point is that some methods are just used in one place and some methods are used in several places. So it's not uncommon, for example, to use, say, social media or an email campaign to communicate different messages to different markets, whereas the website maybe is only used in one place. And finally, consider the budgets and other resources to help you to plan this. And I'll talk about this in the later briefing when we get on to action planning. But essentially you need to build a table like this, and people often do this in Excel, Microsoft Excel, as a convenient way to collect all this information. And then after that you would do a timeline and a roadmap and a project plan as to who does what happens week by week by week or month by month throughout the campaign, what resources are you going to need, and what people and budgets you need to do these different activities. And as I say, I'll talk about that later on when I get to the action planning briefing. But that, in summary, in one chart, is everything you need to know about how to build the elements of a marketing communications plan using the 3Ms model. I'll just add an extra point in here, and this is the basic ways and approaches that one could use to communicate on any given topic. And like the BBC's charter, you need to think about this in several ways. First of all, often communications activities like the BBC are used to speak to the target audiences to either entertain, inform or educate. And in addition to that, there are 4 or 5 common approaches that are used by both charities and by commercial organisations. And I'll show you what those common themes are, these common appeals, in the following list, and show you which ones are relevant to charities and one particular you probably wish to avoid. The first approach, which is very common, is to explain to the target stakeholders, the target audience, the benefits of your products and services. And as I've said many times before in this briefing series, it's very important to communicate essentially the answer to the big question, which is what is it that makes your products and services better and different from your competitors in ways that are valued by and add value to your target audience, to the stakeholders you wish to communicate with. And if you do that effectively, that attracts their attention and it helps to differentiate you from your competition and inform your target audiences about the benefits that they will receive from using your product or services. The next one that's very common in commercial organisation is sometimes used by charities, is talking about the price, or for charities the cost of using the services that they're delivering to their target beneficiaries. And price or cost in the case of charities is one of the most significant ways to indicate or signal value to the target audience. People expect that a higher cost product is usually expected to be of a higher quality. So price or cost, however you articulate it to your charity, articulates either the quality of the product or service or the value that you bring to your stakeholder. So if it's a chargeable service that you're delivering, then you can explain its quality. If it's a no charge service, this really is a good indication of excellent value that you're delivering to your target stakeholder. They're getting something at no cost or no charge to themselves. So price and cost signal both value and quality depending on the context. This might be a bit of a surprise to some of you, but the third most common approach is fear. Now, this is not very often used in commercial organisations, but it is actually very often used in the case of charities. And this is articulating the bad things that happen and the things that the charity is trying to ameliorate, the improvements it's trying to make either to individuals, to society or to the environment. So very often charity advertising or charity communications is highlighting the negative situation that somebody finds himself in, whether it's children without enough to eat, whether it's children who are being abused, whether it's people suffering from mental health issues or animals that are badly treated or problems with the environment. It is a negative approach, but is extremely effective in raising people's awareness and causing an emotional response in the target audience. The other place I think of this where it's used in commercial organisations is talking about life insurance or insurance generally. So if you think about it, you're insuring against a negative thing. So as you look at adverts from insurance companies, you can see the extent to which they talk about the negative things that could happen to you if you have a car accident or accident at the home or you're involved in an accident at work or wherever, and they're explaining to you how they can fix that and provide reparation and restitution if it's appropriate. So fear is a very commonly used approach, particularly in the charity sector. The next appeal that's often used for charities, and it is a bit counterintuitive, is the use of humour. But if you think about some of the great campaigns we've seen over recent years, it does work very well in certain situations. So for example, I guess the most popular one was Red Nose Day. But also the same approach to humour or fun is also used when charities are promoting particular events, whether it's a reception or a gala or a conference, and also fundraising activities. So whether it's a national coffee morning or a race for life or some sporting event or some sponsorship activity, lots of the work that charities do is done with positivity and humour and goodwill, and that is exemplified here. So humour does work in many situations in charities, particularly in the area of fundraising. The next one is a slightly different version of some of the things I've already talked about, and that is in a particularly emotion response that one is seeking, whether it's to make people feel good, help them to avoid fear, or to create some emotional pull or emotional connection with the charity and its work. So the charities use this emotional kind of advertising appeal very successfully in many situations, whether it's trying to engender a feeling of pity or connection or happiness or satisfaction in doing a good job. Emotion is a very positive and useful approach that is very successfully used in many charity campaigns. And finally, one which I don't think has ever been used successfully by charities, and that is the use of sex as an appeal. Now, this is very common in many commercial organisations, whether it's for a chocolate bar or a cosmetics product or a perfume. So the use of sex and sexuality tends to work quite well in certain sectors within commercial marketing, but it's probably inappropriate for most charity applications. Moving on to the next section then, I want to talk about a concept called integrated communications or integrated marketing communications. And there's a particular consideration to make sure that your marketing campaigns work in the most effective ways and the elements of the communications mix work very well together. I'll summarise this approach in 4 particular bullet points. The first one is to make sure that your communications work together and that all of the elements of the communication, the messaging, the target markets, and in fact the tools and techniques that you use work well together, work synergistically and communicate a consistent and clearly understandable message. The second point is that all of the different elements of the communications mix means that they should all work together and support each other and say the same consistent message in a sort of integrated and harmonious way. Promotion is one of the P's in the marketing mix, as you know, and promotions has its own communications tools or the communications mix which I've outlined, and it's important that the P of promotion works with the other P's in the marketing mix, so product, price, promotion, place, people, process, physical evidence work together and consistently in the marketing mix, but also in the communications mix, the different tools and techniques that you use, whether it's online advertising or offline advertising, direct mail, social media, blogging, or the website, all convey the same consistent message using the same terminology and the same style and the same design elements. And finally, on this slide, all of these communications tools work better if they work together rather than in a fragmented or isolationist way. It's just a case of overlooking all of the different things you're doing and asking yourself the question, do these things work well together? And on the next slide, I'm going to give you some specific areas to look at when you're making this determination. I'll give you now on this slide some examples of the things to think about when you're checking for integrated marketing communications, and it's summarised here in a table which I'll go through, which comes from an excellent book called Strategic Marketing Communications, which I first came across in 1997 when I met a couple of the authors at a conference, and the authors are Pulford, Smith and Berry. And in fact the Smith here, one of the authors of this book, is actually the PR Smith, the gentleman who developed the Saucetech model. So it's got a very good pedigree, if you like. So what these 3 academics identified is there are 7 areas you need to consider to make sure that your communications is integrated. The first one is what they call vertical integration, and that needs to ensure that whatever the objectives and mission are of the charity, the things they've asked marketing to do, support those, and marketing develops and delivers communications campaigns to support the marketing objectives, which in turn support the higher level objectives of the charity as a whole. There's then horizontal or functional integration, which is making sure that marketing and the product development people and the service delivery staff and the liaison staff and the service providers all work together to deliver a same consistent service in terms of the beneficiaries and the target stakeholders that is supported by and which supports the messages that are given out in the communications campaign. The third element is something I just touched on the last slide, which is the integration and consistency between the marketing mix. So it's very important that the elements of the marketing mix, product, price, place, people, process, physical evidence, are supported by the promotional messages that go together. Now I'm sure you can all think of commercial organisations where what they say in their advertising and their communications online and offline is in no way relevant or consistent with what the actual service is when you actually go to their retail outlet or to their website to try and get the product. And we can perhaps think of utility companies or mobile phone service providers or some retailers which have got a reputation, or some airlines, for example, where I can think of their marketing communications is not borne out by the quality of the rest of the P's in their marketing mix. The fourth element here is the communications mix, and this is a list, as I've said before, of all the tools and techniques and channels that one can use to deliver the message. And again, it's a case of making consistency of message and consistency of quality and consistency of service delivery that is recognised and exemplified by the messages that you're giving out to the chosen markets using the methods we've identified. The fifth thing is the creative design. It's important that the look and feel of your communications is the same, whether it's delivered in the newspapers, on TV or radio, or on the internet, or in brochures or literature, or at your conferences. Now you can think of very successful commercial companies that have got a consistency of design and a consistency of quality. And you can think of airlines or hotel chains or restaurant chains where it is extremely consistent. What they say is consistent on all the channels. The service you can get is consistent whichever outlet you go to, and the staff give you the same high quality and every customer contact point. Point 6 is internal and external. And again, it's important that you not only think about external communications to your target stakeholders, but make sure your staff are kept on board, whether it's full-time staff, part-time staff, or your volunteers. Make sure that everybody inside and outside the company knows what you're trying to achieve and understands the USP, the unique selling point, and how you're answering the big question. And then finally, make sure that you spend your budget wisely and do just what you need to do to achieve the target outcomes and the target objectives, both the business objectives and the communications objectives. And if you just get these 7 points done to a high quality, you really are delivering high quality integrated marketing communications. So that's all I wanted to say about the concept and the theory. Let's see how we might apply some of this in real situations using a concept which is called the stakeholder journey. This is an idea I've adapted from general commercial use to the specific context of charity marketing. And it talks about the different stages in stakeholder awareness as they understand and become engaged with our charity and perhaps have some long-term relationship with it. And it applies to stakeholders, whether they're a beneficiary or a client of our charity, whether they're a volunteer, or whether they're a donor or a sponsor, or whether they belong to one of our other target stakeholder groups. The first thing we need to do in our communications activity is to make them aware of the services and the things that our charity delivers and the general good that it does in support of its charitable aims and objectives. So the first stage that people go through is to have an awareness of our charity or the charity under consideration. We then need to generate their interest and interact with them so that they consider having a relationship with our charity, whether as a recipient of our services, if they're a beneficiary or a client, to give us money if they're a donor or sponsor, or perhaps to give us their time if they're a volunteer. Once they've got enough information on considering our charity, we want to convert that into some form of positive action, whether it's to actually use our services and our offers if they're a beneficiary or client, to become a volunteer, or to give us some money as a donor or sponsor. Once they've gone through that first positive action, we want to keep a relationship with them and engage with them and work with them and retain them as an active, positive member of our stakeholder groups for the longer term. So this framework describes the thought process and experience that stakeholders go through from the left where they know nothing about us to the right where they know about us, they've engaged with us, they've had a positive outcome, they've taken some positive action with relation to our charity, and we maintain a long-term relationship with them. Following on from that model, which talks about the stages that the different stakeholders go through in their journey of discovery about our charity, let me introduce you to another framework which I've developed specifically for this unit called the RICER model. And this talks about the steps that an organisation, the steps that a charity can take to facilitate the ease of transition across the stakeholder journey in as seamless and as frictionless way as possible. It was developed from a model developed by my friend Dr. Dave Chaffee, which he called the RACE model. And the RACE model was a model that Dave developed to talk about and think about the things that one might do to help management in commercial organisations facilitate the customer journey. So I've adapted that and renamed some of the steps to the RISA model, which talks about the things that a charity can do to facilitate the stakeholder journey. So let me take you through the steps of RISA, which is an acronym which stands for the following points. The first step in the RISA model is reach. And this is where charities need to reach out and communicate and raise the awareness of potential stakeholders to understand the work and the operations of the charity. The second step of RISA is the I, which stands for interact. So once we've made contact and got people to understand and know something about us, we need to start a conversation to help them understand, provide them with information, and to raise their interest in working with or working for or participating or getting benefit from the charity at an individual level. The third step in the RISA model is connect, and this persuades the stakeholders to take some positive action. If it's a beneficiary or client, the positive action would be that they access the charity and take advantage of the products and services that we bring to the market. If they're a volunteer, we hope that they will sign up and start to work with us and provide support and their time and effort to help us in our activities. And if they're a donor or a sponsor, we want them to part with some money to provide financial support for the operations of the charity. So connect in this stage is whatever is a relative positive action depending on the target stakeholder group in question. And the final step in the RISA model is ER, which stands for engage and retain. And this really is to deliver value to the target stakeholder in whatever form that takes, depending on who the stakeholders are, to maintain stakeholder engagement for the longer term, and to have a long-term relationship, a beneficial, mutually value-sharing relationship with the stakeholder, whether they're a client, a beneficiary, a volunteer, a donor, or a sponsor. So those are the 4 steps of the RISA model. On this slide, I'm going to summarise the difference and the complementarity of the 2 models. I talked about the stakeholder journey model on the left-hand side of this, which talks about the stakeholder journey and how they develop a relationship with the charity from the stakeholder's point of view. Complementing that is the RISA model, which is looking at the same stakeholder journey but from the company or the charity's point of view, and it just helps you build a plan for the management activities that you need to put in place and how you might measure success to facilitate a smooth stakeholder journey. So if you like, the stakeholder journey model and the RISA model are 2 sides of the same coin, or as I've shown here, 2 sides of the same scales or balance. They're complementary, co-supporting models, one to look at the world from the point of view of stakeholder and one to look at the world from the point of view of the charity. To summarise what this means and how you'd use this in practice, then we need to think about the following. Here in the blue squares are the 4 steps of the RISA model: reach, interact, connect, engage and retain. So for each of the target stakeholder groups, and I've shown 4 of them here who are beneficiaries, donors, sponsors and volunteers, you need to think about how you would address and facilitate each of the 4 steps of the RISA model. So in actual practice, what this means is that for each stakeholder group you need to complete a small worksheet for each of the 4 steps in the RISA model. So with 4 stakeholder groups as shown in this diagram, and with the 4 steps of the RISA model, 4 times 4 means you would need to complete 16 worksheets. Now, before you think that this seems like an unnecessarily high amount of work, let me develop this idea a little bit further, show you what the worksheets actually look like, what goes on them, and help you to decide where you start, and in fact whether you complete all 16 worksheets or perhaps just focus on a subset if that's more relevant to your charity. Let's look now then at how you might use the RISA model in practice. So let's take the first step of the RISA model and mentally choose a stakeholder group to talk about. Just to remind you, the reach step of the RISA model is all about communicating with potential stakeholders to raise their awareness of the charity and its activities. And in order to do that, there's 3 things that you need to think about, which are shown here. There's the objectives, the SMART objectives that you'd set to measure the success of this stage. the tactics that you will use, which essentially are the elements of the communications mix, and how you might go about measuring success. Now, today we've only covered the first of these columns. We've talked how to develop smart objectives, but I haven't yet given you the full briefing about tactics, because that's coming up in the next briefing session, and we haven't got the full picture on metrics because that's going to happen in a slightly later briefing. But conceptually, just for now, think about, for each step of the RISA model, for each stakeholder group, you need to think of the objectives, the tactics, and the metrics. I'll now fill in how you might start to complete this worksheet looking at the first column that I've given you, the objectives column. And objectives are something we discussed in the earlier briefing when I talked about how to set smart objectives. So if you're not familiar with that, you need a bit of a reminder. Go back to the briefing on objectives and just review and remind yourself how you set smart objectives. So for the reach stage, for the target stakeholder group in question, this is just an example of what you might wish to set objectives for. You might be interested in the number of inquiries that you receive following your campaign. Remember, you're trying to raise awareness of your organisation. So you can measure the success of that perhaps by the number of inquiries, the number of people who've attended an event or a briefing, how many people have signed up for a newsletter or for a form to set up a standing order to be a donor, or people who've requested information or information pack about being a volunteer, or how many people have downloaded any relevant forms or information about the charity and its activity. So those are just samples of the sorts of objectives you might set for the reach stage of the RISA model for your target stakeholder group. So building on from the objectives which we've just set on the previous slide, let's see how we might start thinking about the tactics that we'll use. And again, you haven't had a full briefing on this, and this will be the topic of the next briefing, but here's some examples of the sorts of tactics you could use to help you to achieve the objectives shown here for the reach stage of the RISA model for your target stakeholder group. So the sorts of tactics you could use to raise awareness are things like information that people would find on the website, for advertising, for news placements and public relations, perhaps the result of some events or commercial activity like that you've undertaken, or a social media advertising campaign. And as I said before, I'll go through the tactics in much more detail on the next briefing and tell you exactly which tactics are best for which step of the RISA model. And then finally, to complete this worksheet, we need to look at the metrics, and these are the tools and techniques and methodologies you use to measure the success of the tactics and specifically the achievement of your objectives. And again, I haven't given you a full briefing of this because this is going to be the topic of a much later briefing in this series, but just for now, let me give you just as an example of the sorts of things you could measure, which are inquiries or requests for information, attendee at events, sign-ups, downloads and so on, to measure the success of the tactics and the achievement of the objectives. So that's just a sample worked example of how you might fill in the objectives, tactics and metrics for the first step, the reach stage of the RISA model for one particular target stakeholder group. What I'm trying to work towards is the ability to give you the ability to complete worksheets like this for your charity. So for your charity, I want to give you the skills and the tools by the end of this whole training session, this whole program, to give you enough information for you to be able to set your own objectives, your own tactics and your own metrics, in this example for the reach step of the RISA model for your particular target stakeholder group in this exercise. So at the end of this whole program, you will be able to complete these worksheets yourselves. So I guess some of you might be a little bit confused by now because it's not something that you may have done before and you haven't yet got all the information to fully complete it. But just to summarize, what you need to do for your target stakeholder groups, for example, beneficiaries, volunteers, donors and sponsors, you need to fill in one of these worksheets for each step of the RISA model. So for beneficiaries, you need to fill in a reach, interact, connect, engage and retain worksheet. The same for volunteers, the same for donors and the same for sponsors. So in this example, there's potentially 16 little worksheets you have to fill in like this for your organisation. And for each worksheet, as I've explained, you need to fill in the objectives column, the tactics column and the metrics column to help you to understand what you need to do and how you measure the success of the 4 different steps of RISA for each stakeholder group. Now, if you do the maths, and as I explained before, that's potentially 16 worksheets, which sounds like a huge amount of work. But the good news is, of course, you don't have to do it all at once. If you were doing a full communications plan for your organisation, then eventually in time you would do the four worksheets for each of the RISA steps: reach, interact, connect, engage and retain, for each of the target stakeholder groups. But of course you don't have to try and do everything at once and in one go. You can, for example, choose the most important stakeholder target group. So you might first of all think that fundraising is the most important area for your charity, in which case you'd build a communications campaign just for the donors in the stakeholder group. So you then have to do the 4 worksheets: reach, interact, connect, engage and retain, but just for donors. And again, then you'd fill in the objectives, the tactics and the metrics for each of those steps. But again, you don't have to do each of the 4 steps. You could just work out what you're going to do, for example, for the reach step of donors, in which case it's just 1 worksheet to do with reach for 1 stakeholder group to do with donors. So you need to just think about what's the most important imperative. Where would you get started for your charity? It can be quite overwhelming if you try and do all 16 worksheets all at one go. So I recommend, first of all, just for a sample campaign that you're thinking of doing, decide who is it targeted at. Is it targeted at beneficiaries, volunteers, donors or sponsors? So just choose 1 stakeholder group and think, do you need to do all the 4 steps of the RISA model, or should you just focus on 1 to begin with? So do it in bite-sized pieces that are achievable, rather than trying to boil the ocean and do everything in one go. That completes the main substance of this briefing. What I'd like to do now is just wrap up with a few slides to talk first of all about the next steps in the programme. In the next briefing we're going to continue with our discussion on tactics, but I'm going to give you much more information about the tactics that you use essentially to fill in the worksheets for each step of the RISA model. So we've already done the objectives column in a previous briefing. In the next briefing I'm going to talk about the tactics, the middle column on the worksheets for the RISA model, and then in a later briefing I'll talk about the metrics. So by the end of this whole program you'll be in a position to fill in the worksheets and all of the columns. But the next briefing is tactics part 3, answers the question which way is best, and talks about RISA tactics. I do appreciate this is quite a complex briefing that we've been going through today, so if you have any questions, if anything is unclear, please contact me by email to this address, peter.rees@gmail.com. So if you have any questions or any comments or any feedback about this briefing, then I'd love to hear from you. It just remains for me to finish this briefing with a small concluding remarks and, of course, my final quotation for this briefing. And this comes from a famous source, Lao Tzu, a philosopher, who said that nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. And it's the same with marketing. There's a lot to do, but don't feel you have to do everything in one go. Take your time, take it in measurable, achievable steps, and in time you will accomplish everything that you wish to. So to wrap up, I'd just like to thank you as always for your time. I hope you found this briefing interesting and useful. Now, I do appreciate we covered quite a lot of areas today, so if there's anything that's not fully clear, please feel free to go back and review any parts that you need to in this briefing or previous ones. We're about halfway through our journey of discussing tactics now, and there's more to come, and I'll continue our discussion on the communications mix in the next briefing. So thank you for your time, and I'd just like to finish by saying goodbye, good luck, and good marketing.